Welcome back to Good Revenue. We are recording this tail end of what seems to be a pretty significant economic collapse in response to tariffs unilaterally implemented by the US president. The president announced tariff hikes that appear to be the worst since the 1930s, which was not a decade that many remember fondly. They affect 60 countries. And as we're recording this, the stock market has just absolutely cratered. So it's a lively week. And so we brought an old friend, Erik Olson, who is the president of Venn Strategies. He's based in DC, and he's going to talk to us about what is actually happening with all of this. So we're going to get into some analysis of the trade policy, some taxes, and we'll also kind of talk through what Erik thinks might happen as a result of all of this. So we're expecting some crystal balls here from an old friend.
Right.
How's that for a setup? You like that? Amazing. So Erik, thank you so much for joining us here today. I know we're going to ask you a ton of questions that there probably aren't easy answers to, but nonetheless, the scope of this is just staggering. I mean, absolutely staggering, I think, to a lot of people. There are all sorts of, just initial reactions. My personal favorite being that we appear to have tariffed an island inhabited only by penguins. What is your takeaway?
They have tariffs on us. So there is some sort of reciprocity that need to happen.
I mean, penguins seem threatening. Sure. Absolutely. What is your top takeaway as you react to this?
Top takeaway, or there's only one takeaway. I mean, the penguins have cold, dead eyes. You're looking at them, they're fierce behind there. You got to worry about them. It's a lot to digest. This has been, as you noted, a very interesting week, but one long predicted. I think that's the thing that, talking to clients, talking to people around DC, there was a lot of people that thought this is not going to happen. Like, he's threatened this before. He's always wanted to do a lot of tariffs. Like, he talked about this in the first administration, but he always backed down at the last minute. It was used for leverage. I think, though, we're seeing that he was telling the truth when he started talking about this during the campaign, throughout the fall post-election, and then into this year. He's been saying, we're going to do tariffs. This is a long-held goal. The people that prevented President Trump from doing this in 2018, 2019, they're not there anymore. Gary Cohen and Steven Mnuchin and others inside the first Trump administration, the adults in the room that came from Wall Street and didn't want to see the economic distress that we're seeing now, aren't there. Everyone else is a loyalist and is firmly with the president and repeats his talking points and says everything's going to be okay. The markets aren't the economy. We don't need to be watching that. This is a reset. It's going to take time. There's going to be pain, and we're going to get through it. But I don't think anyone was expecting the amount of what's happened this week and the amount of tariffs that have hit across the board, whether it's the 10% worldwide or, as you pointed out, the 60 countries that are getting their own individual tariff rates. It's expansive and a lot to sort of think through and consume, and you're already seeing reactions, right? The Chinese have already said, that they're going to put 34% tariff in place as a counter to what the president did. And I think we're going to see more of that days to come. What I think about when the president is, what are his goals here? Goal one, wants more production in the United States. So whether that's onshoring, new businesses, new engines of growth, whether it's AI or data centers, he wants to see that technology here, wants to see that growth here. Second is revenue. Certainly talk about that. And we've seen Peter Navarro on the Sunday shows talking about all these tariffs are going to raise $6 trillion in revenue over 10 years. And that revenue.
We'll get into that in a minute, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then third is leverage. And that's the thing that the president loves, is having this leverage to talk to other countries and get them to bend to his will. But what he hasn't been clear on is, what does he want from the penguins? It's not clear.
Right. God, what a segue. Yeah, I think there's also a real concern. I have this concern. Is the goal here for the president to assume control of the U.S. economy? How are all of our corporate leaders and private companies okay with that? It just feels, again, I'm a moderate, you're a moderate, been a registered independent most of my life and career. What are we doing? How is that an acceptable goal at this point in time?
I don't think it's an acceptable goal, and I don't think most business leaders would say that, but everyone's scared. Republicans are scared, right? Democrats are talking about this actively, but, it's like shouting into the void for those of us that sit on that side of the aisle. Business leaders know that if they raise their voice, if they go out in the press, that the president's going to attack. And the last thing they want is to be in the crosshairs. We're seeing what's happening on a whole host of different angles, whether it's law firms that are getting letters about, their work. And, we don't need to get into that right now, but individual corporations don't want to be targeted by the president. They see how he's sort of on this retribution tour right now and targeting people. So they're having conversations. There are conversations. People have the Treasury Secretary's phone number. They have Lutnick's cell phone number. They have Jameson Greer's number. Like, they're calling and saying, please, please, please don't do this. What do we do to make this go away? So those private pleadings are happening, but they're not hitting the public. I don't expect them to until something breaks, and breaks more than we already have it, and the president feels like he needs to switch course and the floodgates open for exemptions, et cetera. So we'll see if we get to that point. But the early moments of all this tariff action certainly seem to be going the opposite direction than the president wants. But again, he keeps saying the market's not the economy, stock market's not the economy. We need to let things settle. We need to see what happens and let this play out a little bit. And there's going to be some pain, but the benefit's going to be huge.
Yeah, right. Well, it's fascinating too, because obviously his take in the first term was that the economy was very much reflected in the stock market. So that's really interesting. But I am also curious to know, if you take him at his word that what he really wants to do is rebuild a manufacturing base in the United States at, again, best case, how is anyone supposed to make those investments with this level of chaos and uncertainty? Because again, there's the dramatic size and scope of these tariffs. As you noted, China has retaliated, unsurprisingly. Today, we're expecting retaliation from the EU. In this list of tariffs, we're basically treating our allies worse than our adversaries, maybe with the exception of China and dependent countries on China. From the perspective of the business community, how is this actually going to help anyone build that manufacturing base if, in fact, they want to do that?
I don't think it will. Honestly, again, we don't have an industrial policy. We're not a communist country. We're not China. We can't plan out. I think if you are a company that is a fully globally integrated company, I'm thinking like Big Pharma, for example, you're not, other than like Eli Lilly saying they're going to build facilities here, you're not going to be able to source your chemicals here. You're not going to be able to build a chemical plant to do API in 4 years. So you're going to wait it out. Will we see some onshoring and reshoring? 100%. Will we see some announcements like we have from something like Hyundai, has made major announcements? We're going to see those. The president loves making those announcements, loves making deals. So I think we'll see that continue to happen. But shovels in ground won't happen right away. Manufacturing certainly won't happen before this president's term is over. I don't think we're going to see that. If you're a business leader, you're going to wait. You're going to charge your customers more, as much as you can, to recoup the cost of the tariffs and whatever else is happening from your supply chain, and you're going to wait for policy to change. Because again, the tools that the president's using here are light switches. If you're talking about 232 studies and 301 studies, that takes time. There's public input. There's a lot of opportunity to comment, to shape how those ultimately look. But when you're using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, it is literally the president flipping on and off a switch. So presumably on January 20th, 2029, the next president could flip the switch off and these could go away. Or President Trump could turn them off in 8 months. So why would you invest? Why would you plan unless it's just something that you think you can get an instant deal from the president because you're making a $4 trillion or $4 billion announcement about investing in the United States somewhere?
You're also, I think, alluding to what I would say is daylight seemingly between what the president is saying and what his staff are saying, right? The staff came out and said, or the cabinet secretaries came out and said, this is the lay of the land. This is what's going to happen. And the president has almost immediately started to indicate that there is some kind of negotiation. Some are characterizing it as like a tribute, some kind of, appeal to him to relieve pressure. Do you think that this is going to basically, in the near term at least, really be this kind of one-off when it comes to both countries and firms? And the related question is, that feels like a nightmare administratively. And you and we've talked about this before, but just the process of then actually enforcing and managing all of that is going to be, it's just going to be immense. So what do you think?
Yeah, you're right. It's going to be really hard to do all this, but I think the president relishes this. There's already been some early news reporting about now he loves being on the phone. He loves making a deal. He's the ultimate deal maker, right? This is his persona.
He's in the center of all. Right.
Right. And so now he gets to hold the world economy in his hand and have every leader in the world call him, come to DC, host him in their country, and he gets to try to cut deals. What those are, I think, is a mystery in many cases. We talk about this with our allies, why are we punishing Canada and Mexico? Okay, but now we're punishing them. So what do you want? I mean, Scheinbaum immediately put 10,000 more troops on the border. Trudeau put more drones in the air. And now, the new prime minister is going to win an election because he's going to be anti-Trump. Like, what is it that he wants out of these countries? It's not clear. He wants leverage. He has it. Okay, so now what do we do with that leverage? And I think it's going to be a lot of conversations and a lot of time will tell, what exactly these countries are willing to do to make these tariffs go away. So I think we're still we're 72 hours after announcement here. We're still very early stages of what will happen.
Right. And in the meantime, I mean, there's some real negative effects, I think, coming to all of us as consumers and as households, right? I've seen estimates anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000. And then there's a Larry Summers estimate that actually is saying these tariffs are going to cost something like $30 trillion, which would be a household cost of $300,000. I mean, that's just insane. I really hope he's wrong, but he's a smart person. So I'm guessing there's some actual data there.
He's right a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of, again, alluded to this earlier, but part of the rationale for this, if it isn't the command and control of the economy and of companies and the world, there's also this revenue component. How is the revenue actually going to materialize if we've basically crushed consumers in this country and, again, globally? But I know we don't care about global. We just care about this. How does that work? How does that work from a revenue perspective?
I mean, I think there's a lot of question marks here, right? Part of one of the early announcements, one of the executive orders, something that Lutnick is supposed to put in place is this, new revenue collection agency, external revenue collection agency that will be the warehouse for all these tariffs. Again, we can talk about the administrative challenges of trying to collect tariffs, different rates from countries around the world that we're importing goods from. But, I think it's a funny math game, right? We're right in the middle of a reconciliation conversation. The Senate's, debating their reconciliation bill as we speak. They're going to spend a lot of money. They want to extend, the current tax law for many, many years, and that costs trillions of dollars. Official scorekeepers, again, this is getting like the nerdy math of DC, but the official scorekeepers here don't count tariffs unless you put it in the bill. And members of Congress don't want to put in the bill because they have to vote on approving tariffs. They're happy to let the president do that and not have to take the brunt of the punishment of approving these. But they sure do want that revenue. And, if we're going to collect some level of revenue, right? We're not going to fully cut off goods coming into the United States. We're not, putting up walls in that regard. Yes, it will slow down. People will buy less. There's going to be a lot of punishment on low-income households, middle-class families are going to pay a lot more. They're going to restrict, right? They're going to hoard cash. They're not going to spend the same way that they have been. And that's going to have other implications that will, trickle through the economy. But we will collect more revenue. It's just going to be a fact of life. But how do they account for that? And how do they use that as an offset, right? And I think, I've said this to a few folks. At the end of the day, I think we're going to have a press release that comes out from the White House that says, yes, we passed the tax bill. It cost $2 trillion, but we're projecting to collect $3 trillion in tariffs revenue, and that revenue offset this, and we're going to help, take some of that revenue to offset the deficit. And look, on paper here, it's easy math, A, B minus C, whatever it is. So I think that's how they're going to account for it. And again, this is my guess, I'm purely speculating, but given that that revenue is not going to go into a reconciliation bill to pay for tax cuts, they're going to say it helped pay for tax cuts because we collected that revenue.
So fake math to get the bill done.
Real math.
Real economics. Real math.
Real math.
Real math for voters. Wow. Okay.
Well, it is a political system that we live in. Yeah.
It sure is. But I'm going to ask you something too, because you're also a tax expert. And I genuinely wonder about this. If we've gone so far off the grid in terms of what is now possible in this, this timeline we're living in 2025, why don't we just do a VAT or something else? Because it really feels like that is something that he seems more comfortable with. I've often thought, just when I kind of hear the administration talk about this, that's actually what they're talking about, right? So for an American, it's more like having a sales tax across everything instead of just state and local. So why don't we just do that? I mean, is that too simplistic of a question to ask?
Why push the easy button? The easy thing is always the hardest thing. You're a former Senate staffer and House staffer. You know that is impossible. I mean, the president is using tools that are firmly within his unilateral ability to wield, right? Getting things through Congress is hard. Getting a bat through Congress, I think, would be impossible, maybe. But look, Trump has bent the will of the Republican Party for him, right? So maybe if he said, like, this is how we get it done, they do it. But there's a lot of traditional Republicans that are still in Congress that abhor the idea of a VAT. There's Senator Cassidy from Louisiana is trying to implement a sort of VAT-like thing for carbon, and it's been hard to message because he's trying to do one thing without calling what it is, and a lot of Republicans see right through it. So I think it'd be really hard to put a VAT in place because you'd have to move it through Congress when the president can just say, it's a national emergency, tariffs. That's so much simpler for him to do and for him to control. Why would he go through the rigmarole of trying to get things through Congress? Way too hard.
I mean, it's just hard not to laugh because he obviously really is dominating the Congress and everything else he's doing by fiat. So you would think that this too could happen. Again, it's just the opinion from the West Coast peanut gallery this morning.
Fair enough.
But, okay. Well, let's get a little bit into some of the kind of global responses and what you think is going to happen in terms of trade relations, if we even have any after this. China retaliated this morning aggressively. We're waiting on the EU, as we noted earlier. And it seems like a lot of these tariffs are really very Sino-centric. So they affect Vietnam, Cambodia, other countries. You and I have talked before about even some of what we're doing with respect to Mexico really seems to be about China. How do you see all of this playing out? Because one thing, again, I do think there's like a kernel or a thread of something that actually makes sense, which is that China has taken advantage of global trade policy and the WTO for decades, and it has caused real issues. So what's your sense of this as you look at the landscape?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of thoughts sort of come from that question. Big question. Yes, the big question. So I think, and if the theory is the president wants leverage and that he wants to negotiate new agreements, new compacts, the USTR and his team were in the UK, we're in India, we're in Japan, so there's active conversations happening. We can get into how you actually get a free trade agreement into law and what that looks like, because that's a whole other thing that we need.
And do they even matter? Because we've just tariffed countries with whom we had free trade agreements.
Right. But we're actually going to have some sort of right. Don't need to get into it. But
sidebar. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry,
no. I mean, the point is he's trying to do agreements and try to find paths forward for these different countries. And China is a big piece of that. I mean, we've talked about this before, but the ultimate goal seems like we want to renegotiate USMCA, right? We know it's Trump's perfect trade deal, and he got rid of NAFTA to create this new structure. But what we've seen in the years since USMCA became law, and the trade, pact for the continent, is Chinese manufacturers and investment moving into Mexico to circumvent the 301 tariffs. And that's something members of Congress are acutely aware of on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill. So I think that if you start to target that, or obviously you saw Vietnam has a really high tariff rate as part of that, because we know a lot of Chinese investments gone there, and Malaysia, Cambodia. So I think that's certainly part of the calculation here is, the Chinese are just moving their money around versus having to come out of China. And how do you capture that? If the goal is to level the playing field, and we can go into a deep, deep conversation if we wanted to about how the Chinese try to dominate industries and the tool that they use to do that. So I do think there's some validity there about how you tackle that. Starting a worldwide trade war, maybe not the way to do it. Right. Blanket tariffs across all goods. Again, I don't think that's how I would do it. I would, target sector by sector. And we're seeing that a little bit come out of the conversation from Tuesday. Not only do we have these blanket tariffs, but there were announcements that maybe we're going to have a critical minerals 232. We have lumber 232. We have copper.
Will you just explain for people who maybe aren't as in the weeds, like 232, 301, tell the audience, because I don't think people are going to be as familiar.
Yeah, of course. Since 1930, as you mentioned from the beginning, we had all these tariffs that came out of Congress. And then they said, well, that was a horrible idea, so we're going to give away that authority. We're not going to do tariff policy from Congress anymore. We're going to cede that authority to the president. So there's been a series of big trade acts, 1933, 1974, that, those are some of the biggest ones that were these massive trade acts. They basically gave the president authority to do tariffs. There's a lot of different tools. So the ones you hear commonly, from the first administration was the 301 tariffs. This is a tool that the United States Trade Representative holds, and they conduct a study. The one that was done on China was on IP theft, and the way to punish IP theft was to put blanket tariffs in place on an assortment of goods. And there was these different tranches and buckets of goods, and, heavy machinery, there was critical mineral, and it captured a good chunk of the Chinese exports. So that's the 301. Again, that if you do that, there's a study, there's input, there's public letters, there's hearings.
There's a process.
There's
Yeah.
a whole process that goes along with that. It's not fast. And so that's part of the reason why the president's using the tool IEPA. The other big one we'll hear a lot about is 232. 232 studies are done by the Department of Commerce at the International Trade Administration, and they focus on a national security threat. So, and it's done unilaterally through the department. The president says, or the Secretary of Commerce will say, either one can, and say, we need a study. We don't have enough uranium, or we need to have that as a national security concern, or lumber, or cars. That's the autos that are done through 232. And there's a long study that Commerce does. Again, there's opportunities for public input. And then they produce a study to give it to the Secretary of Commerce. And the Secretary of Commerce gives it to the president. And the president says, put tariffs on, or let's not do it. So it is a process again. And so the auto tariffs, there was a 232 study done in the president's first term. And that's what he's basing the auto tariffs on. Steel and aluminum, there was a 232 tariff or study done in the first administration. So the new 232 steel and aluminum tariffs are based off of that previous study. So that's just, being put into law based off of that. But anything further, these other 232s we're talking about will undergo or have started to undergo, like copper is in the middle of a 232 study. Lumber, we're talking about critical minerals, we're talking about pharmaceuticals. So that will be a long process. And then you can do country specific, you can do worldwide, you can do a lot with those tools. So those are the biggest one. There's lots of other numbers that you throw out in different parts of the code that are used, but those are the ones you're going to hear the president utilize the most.
I think that's super helpful. Thank you. I think that'll be helpful for
I can do nerdy stuff. You need me too.
No. That's great. The nerdy stuff. I mean, we're in the nerdy land. And even as you're talking about it, again, there's a thread that makes sense, which is you are describing a lot of process. It is time consuming. Maybe that process doesn't meet the moment, but on the other hand, maybe coming up with these like back of the envelope calculations based on our trade deficit and not tariffs is a bad idea too, right? It just feels like there's some middle ground where it just would make a little bit more sense. Again, just
right,
putting that out there in the ether in the hopes that maybe something
a little more study, a little more time, a little more analysis,
just a little more. Like it doesn't. I'm all for it. Doesn't need to be years of wasted time. I mean, again, right. I'm impatient, as we both know, so I'm totally with that.
But yeah, the Department of Commerce is built for this number crunching exercise, and
right.
they're really good at it, and they are data driven. But that's not what we're doing now. We're using IEPA, which is this, like I said before, on-off switch.
Right. No, it's a blunt instrument where we needed a scalpel.
A little bit.
And one related question too is our treatment of allies seems really chaotic and again unnecessary. South Korea, Mexico, India are all. It sounds like in the process of negotiation in these tariffs, it looks like we're treating South Korea worse than Brazil, even though Brazil actually competes more with us. So you would think we would do it the other way around. We have a free trade agreement with Korea. How should allies think about what has happened this week and how to move forward? What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I sometimes I think that this president doesn't think we have allies, right? Or that the allies are not the traditional allies that we've had. We know he has
Russia apparently,
right?
now suddenly an ally.
Well, there's sanctions in place there, so we don't need new tariffs. That's what the Treasury Secretary said.
Sure.
So I do think, he has a different worldview, right? We know he does not like Europe in any way, shape, or form. He likes the UK. Brexit's going to turn out to be a good thing for them, I think, at the end of the day, oddly enough, because they will be able to negotiate their own free trade agreement, because I doubt there's going to be an EU trade agreement anytime soon. Mm-hmm. He is happy to punish Europe for a whole host of grievances, real or imagined. I don't understand the calculus when we're trying to target countries like Japan or Korea that if our goal is to, wall off China or compete with China, we need to have the allies in the region that are most acutely in danger of China's growth or military ambition. And so I don't understand, I don't see the theory of harming our neighbors in that region that we really need and don't have the level of investment from China like Vietnam or Cambodia or others have, but actually are building their militaries or trying to provide for a good defense and trying to grow their economies and be partners with us in the region, both through our military and economically. So I don't understand it. Same with Canada and Mexico. Mm-hmm. We have a 7-year-old free trade agreement that was approved by the president And now he's, trying to rip that up because of fentanyl, I guess, and immigrants, which both of those numbers for either, people or goods moving across the border are down. And we're going to alienate Canada, who we buy a lot of their stuff and they buy a lot of our stuff. Same with Mexico. It's a fully integrated North American system that we've built for decades, for hundreds of years at this point, and we don't want to throw that to the wayside. So I don't understand the theory. Again, it's all about leverage. And when the president isn't clear about what he wants out of these negotiations, it's hard for them to respond. And they just go on to the defense instead, which is not the position that we want them to be in. So, yeah, I mean, I don't understand. He hasn't been clear about the ultimate goals, so it's hard to know what the path forward is necessarily.
Yeah. No, I mean, I get that. And it's so crazy too, because to your point, leverage, if you want leverage, like we had a lot of leverage. It was in our military and our foreign policy. And we've just, cratered all of that again for no reason in the span of a few weeks. And if you don't want immigration from a lot of countries, maybe we should shore those countries up so people have, successful, productive lives.
Absolutely, right. And yeah,
seem to work pretty well in general. Like it's just hard to process, I think, because the rate and pace of change is so aggressive in these not even 100 days, right? It's just
76.
70. Yeah, of course, because you've got a counter going on.
On the calendar, we're cross off your dates. It's right.
Amazing. Another question I have for you on implementation. One of the more maybe innovative policy ideas in this tariff drama, whatever we are doing here, is this idea of a 20% domestic product requirement. How do you think that this will work in practice? Because it could be intriguing, but again, it seems like it's a lot of administrative burden to actually manage.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, how do you implement? How do you give CBP the tools? Customs and Border Patrol. So I shouldn't be using all these acronyms. How do you give customs the tools to be able to say, like, this good has this content amount, whether it's U.S. content or Chinese content or Russian content? Like, goods get modified, they get they become parts of other things, and so how do you give customs, who is already understaffed and under resourced and stretched super thin, the ability to be able to capture these things and identify them? I mean, people, countries mislabel product all the time. Say something's different in a container. They can't look in every container. They can't look in every box. It's really, really a nightmare. And it seems very easy to game as a system. I mean, it may be a good talking point that, like, suddenly a lot more goods are coming in with U.S. content or will receive U.S. content, or whatever the case may be, however they implement it. But I think it's going to be, again, sort of weird math on paper versus, what's actually happening. Because, again, I just don't think CBP has the tools or the resources. And I don't see a bill moving through Congress to hire 10 times more CBP officers and give them new data systems and computers and technology to be able to track all of this. It's really hard. It's going to be hard enough just with the new tariff regime for each country to have their own tariff rate, which is new versus what has been common practice before or law before.
You do a lot of work with manufacturing. Supply chains are clearly going to be pretty dramatically affected as a result of this. Do you have any predictions or analysis around how you think supply chains, investments might change, especially for complicated products, autos, electronics, goods like that are very high value?
Yeah, I mean, so many of the manufacturers I work with are North American supply chains. So first and foremost, the goal is, how do we unwind what's happening with the steel and aluminum tariffs and whatever reciprocal tariffs or other tariffs, fentanyl, IEEPA tariffs that are in place for Canada and Mexico? We have to solve that first, because the North, as we were saying before, right, the North American supply chain is really strong. It's well developed. It's not new. There's lots of manufacturing and development across the continent. So we have to solve that. Let's get the USMCA renegotiation. Let's prepare for that. Let's build for that. Otherwise it's conversations about sourcing. Really, is the only place in the world you can buy this aluminum sheet from Sweden? Can you not source it from India or from Mexico or from somewhere in Michigan, right? So it's a conversation about those supply chains and where can they bring stuff back. And if the case is, this is really the only place that makes this level, this quality of steel and this shape and size, and it's exactly what we need. And if we don't use them, we're at the jack costs up on, vehicle X by amount, then we're preparing that narrative. Because we really haven't touched on this yet, but the exemption process that was in place for 232s. I mean, when the president signed the new executive order on steel, aluminum, 232 tariffs, he had washed away 7 years, 8 years of exemptions. So those are gone. People have them to buy these goods anymore. His justification was, steel and aluminum was dropping because too many exemptions were put in. So we need to see those go away and have production ramp up here in the United States again. There's going to be a process at some point. We all believe in town, talking to folks inside of the Commerce Department and USTR and White House, like staff are quietly having these conversations, even though the president keeps saying no, no, no. But it's not practical to not have one at some point. Now, look, we're not living in the most practical times, so I may be eating my words later or in months, but really all we have right now, because there isn't a process, is to prepare for one. And so how do we talk to, manufacturers should be preparing their case, making sure that they can only source from this one place, or that the mill down the road just won't do it for whatever reason. So prepare the information, prepare the data, get ready to file something, and then quietly have conversations with Republicans on the Hill. Because again, they're not going to shout from the rooftops anytime soon, but they're happy to make a call to, Lutnick's chief of staff or Jameson Greer, or have a sidebar when they're up doing a congressional hearing and saying, like, I am getting pounded by my Ohio X producers of X, and I need an exemption process. When is that happening? Like, they're logging this information, they're gathering it. The president isn't there yet. His top officials are saying it's not going to happen anytime soon if it ever happens. But you got to prepare for it, because there's no other real option right now other than changing your supply chain, which maybe there's some tweaking things you can do, but it's not realistic immediately.
Yeah. And as we were discussing earlier, I mean, how would you even know where to recite something or where else you should go, right? Because that would change too. I mean, it's a real planning nightmare for businesses.
It's really, really hard. And again, if you can wait and hope that something goes away, or you stockpiled X good for a while so you can deliver for the next year. I mean, businesses don't think in quarter. I mean, they think in quarters for how they report information, but not how they source their goods. So yeah, it's a real nightmare. And I think there was a lot of people that were just thinking like he wasn't going to do it, but now that he's done it and he keeps digging in, which I think is the president's reflex, is everyone says I shouldn't do this, I'm going to stand firmer that I should. He truly believes this the way forward. There's got to be other ways that you have these conversations with him to see him slowly back up. He said a couple times that, there's going to be some exemptions, but they're very little. There's going to be very little exemptions. So he knows that this is realistic, but he doesn't want to open the floodgates by any stretch.
Yeah, just wild. Well, so looking ahead, it seems like there are a couple scenarios here, right? Let's say by some miracle he's right, and this actually works out as, best case, and you get a manufacturing base in the U.S. and it's all fine, like great. More likely, that's not going to be the reality. If someone is trying to think about this from the perspective of, if this goes really poorly, worse than he anticipated and the administration anticipated, what do you think happens? Does some of this get rolled back? Are there other options? Does Congress, wake up and maybe decide to do something? Like what could happen, do you think?
Yeah. Well, again, going back to the president has the ability to turn a lot of these on and off by himself, right? The president has the ultimate tariff authorities. So I do think if things get really bad, he could pull a switch. He doesn't want to, right? He doesn't want to turn these off. He really
he'll see that as defeat, right?
Right. And that's not how the president, walks through life, right? That's not how he has positioned himself. So I think that's unlikely. I think Congress, this week, in fact, Chuck Grassley from Iowa, a very senior Republican, very close with the president, introduced legislation with Maria Cantwell from Washington, Democrat, head of the ranking member of the Commerce Committee on the Senate side, introduced legislation to bring the yank back tariff authority to Congress. Is that going anywhere? John Thune's not about to put that on the Senate floor. Mike Johnson is definitely not putting it on the House floor anytime soon. But, you're starting to see these sorts of cracks, and we'll see what happens. I mean, again, it's 72 hours. So the impacts on consumers, the impacts on farmers, on our manufacturers has not fully been felt. We've only seen, as noted before, that China has, announced their new tariffs. We haven't seen that from other countries. So I think it's just early days. Yeah. If things get really bad, I think the president could turn things off again. What does that do? How does it unwind? Do other people take their tariffs away? Do they feel comfortable that they're going to stay off? huge questions. But you could see, real trade reforms, real changes in how we govern these laws in the future. I don't think it's going to happen immediately. It may be a 2027 sort of activity if Congress, goes the Democrats' direction, and still probably won't be signing the law because the president want to give that authority away. So we may be looking 4 years in advance still to see any real changes. I don't think Trump's going to sign laws that take away his power, especially when it comes to this unilateral tariffs authority. So it's hard to see what the future looks like. I think given we're still swimming through the information and reading the EOs and the annexes that are coming out, it's hard to know what the real impact will be. I think, let's talk again at the end of April.
For sure. Yeah. Well, and so one more question on this. Do you anticipate legal challenges? And if so, where do you think those might come from?
Yeah, I think, definitely. We are in a litigious society right now. I definitely see challenges to the authorities that the president's using. Look, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act is a law from the late 70s. It was signed into law by Jimmy Carter. It's been used many times. In fact, President Trump, of the 13 national emergency declarations that he announced in his first term, 11 of them were backed by IEPA. So that's a very common thing to use this for. Is this law? It's never been used for tariffs. So this is the first time. Now people say well, it's never been used for tariffs. Tariffs not in the law. He can't use it for tariffs. I think my guess is if it got to the Supreme Court, they'd say that he has the authority because he has all tariff authority. And also I think about, the predecessor law to IEPA was the War Powers Act, which Nixon used to put tariffs in place. So it's not the tool in its earlier forms or the law in its earlier forms was used for tariffs. So I have a hard time seeing anyone win a case. The Constitution and the Supreme Court's going to give a lot of, and again, not an attorney, but going to give a lot of authority to the president to declare national emergencies well within his power and to use tariff powers because, again, well within his power to use as a tool for whatever the case may be. But I think in the case of IEPA, it'll be solid. 232, a lot harder to challenge. They follow the process, they go through the process. We don't like the outcome of the study that comes out, but it is firmly planted in a lot of data and a lot of work and we have 5 decades of case law and everything that precedes it. So I think that's really hard to unwind and try to challenge. IEPA, because it's more loosey-goosey, it feels like, on and off switch, as we've talked about. I can see where you can think that there could be challenges there, but if that reached the Supreme Court, I would be shocked if they said that wasn't within his authority to use the tools that way.
Wow, just wild. You're not going to be bored anytime soon. That's for sure. Amazing. Well, Erik, thank you so much for joining us. I think it's been really helpful to get this analysis in such a wild and crazy week. And hang in there. And yeah, we'll have you back to explain more of this because I have no doubt it'll continue to stay very, very interesting. So
we're not done anytime soon.
No, there's days and months and years to come. So.
Years coming off of my life.
I'm aging as we're recording. So
as we speak.
Amazing.
No, thank you so much for having me on. Real pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, leave us a review, subscribe to the show, or check out another episode. We appreciate your support.